Welcome to the 38th in our Middle Eastern history series. Today we're going to pick up where we left off last time, discussing the ancient Assyrians as well as the Kurds, and hopefully we'll get to the Ottoman Middle East. Some of that will probably roll over into next week, which is perfect because it fits in very nicely with what we're going to cover then, which is the internal convulsions within the Ottoman Empire towards the end of the 19th century. So for those of you who know the rules, permit me. These are they. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. I'm just a layperson who finds this very interesting, and I hope you do too. I'm going to try and give this presentation from a secular perspective, despite the fact that we will be talking about religious topics. Of course, as there should be sensitivity whenever you're talking about religious or quasi-religious topics, we should be respectful. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put them in the chat. I do read the chat and respond in real time. And what I like to say is that class is a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. Next, when I put dates below somebody, that is their years of service in the role. That's not when they were born and died, although it can sometimes be when they died. As is typical, I have a 2-hour hard stop, which means that by the time that we get to 9 p.m., anything that I haven't covered, we'll leave off for next week. And finally, this is recorded, so you can watch it later along with the other 37 entries into this series. All right, and the other things that are available from our group concerning ancient Rome, ancient Greece, medieval armor, European Union, everything. So remember last time we decided we're going to talk about the Jazeera. That's that region between the 4 rivers in the northern part of Iraq. And the dominant peoples today are the Assyrians and the Kurds being far more numerous than the Assyrians. They're also what are called Turkmen, but Turkmen fall into the larger category of Turks that we have been talking about. These are groups that are similar in many respects to the Kizilbash, to Azerbaijanis, and to the eastern citizens of the citizens who live in the eastern part of the Republic of Turkey today. And we pointed out that they live just below the Armenian plateau, in the increasingly mountainous parts where the Tigris River has its sources and where the Euphrates River sort of passes on the western side. And we talked about how the Assyrians have their own language, the Assyrian language being a form of Aramaic that has survived into the present, or at least that's the modern Assyrian language. And the Kurds having a language that is in the Iranic family, and the Kurds actually having several different languages that, for the reasons of national cohesion and national unity, are often considered as a Kurdish language, despite the fact that, as you can see, Kurmanji, Sorani, and Sazaki, which are probably the most famous Kurdish languages, are somewhat different in the way that you would expect, like, for example, Romance languages to be somewhat different. We also discussed that there was a theory that the Assyrians, when Haran was destroyed in 609 BC, that the Assyrians were sort of effectively wiped off the map, and they really don't exist until the modern period. And today, I'm going to try and show that that's actually not the case, that archaeological evidence and the majority of scholars seem to believe that the Assyrian people continue after the fall of the country of Assyria, and they even continue until today. By contrast, we don't really have any connective tissue between the Kurdish claim they're descended from Medes and any historical mentioning of the Kurds. And we're going to sort of see the Kurds join history and how they interact with the various powers that are going on. And to give a sense of where we're going to cover, right, last week we covered all the way up to the Middle Median period, but today we're going to take it from the post-Imperial Assyrian period and hopefully get into some of the Ottoman traditional period, and we'll see where we go. So We remember that the Assyrian Empire was this large empire that existed in three distinct phases. You had the old phase, where Assyria was just a city-state based in Ashur, Ashur being the place from which Assyria gets its name. We also had Shamshi-Adad and his founding of the Assyrian Empire. We saw the middle Assyrian period, when Assyria begins to become more expansive, taking up territory in the northern part of the Mesopotamian region, and defeating Mitanni, which controlled most of what is today Syria, in order to become a great power in that would be in conflict with Hatti and Egypt and Babylon. We then discussed how the middle Assyrian kingdom was defeated by the Arameans, who launched repetitive strikes into the territories of Assyria at the same time that the Sea Peoples were ravaging the areas along the Mediterranean coast. And this gave rise to the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which saw itself in conflict with Urartu, that regional ally that we discussed in lectures 21 and 22, 22 and 23, which is the forerunner of Armenia. We had at the end of the Neo-Assyrian period, we had the greatest expansion of Neo-Assyrian power, including conquests in the Levant region, up to and including Egypt as well. And we also saw the Medes beginning to expand their power from northwestern Iran, and expanding into the Jazeera as well as eastern Iranian regions. You then had the apex of Assyria, where it controlled all of those areas in green. Those are what are called pahitu, or provinces. Then you have those areas in sort of that light green, and those areas in light green are vassal states. And so you can see pretty much all of the Middle East was either in alliance with Assyria, or one of its vassal states, by the reign of Ashurbanipal. But when Ashurbanipal died, a number of the vassal states began to break away. Babylon rebelled, led by their king Nabopolassar, and the Medes joined into an alliance with them. The Medes, led by their king Quachares, as he's known by the Greeks, or Uvashtra, as he's known by the Persians. And at first, they sacked the city of Nineveh in 612 after a prolonged siege. The Assyrians retreat under their new king Ashur-uballit II and defend the city of Haran, which falls in 609 BC. And that's pretty much where we left off last time, with the destruction of the Assyrian Empire and the prevailing rule of the Babylonians in the south and the Medes in the north. I apologize, this map is in German. Where it says Meda, those are the Medes, and where it says Chaldea, those are Chaldeans or Babylonians. All right. So we now have to deal with the fact that Assyrians are no longer in power. So what are the ways that we've begun to see Assyrians in this post-Assyrian period? The first place of interest is actually Durkat Limu. Durkat Limu is an archaeological site in the northeastern part of Syria, very close to the Iraqi border. It's today a Kurdish majority region, and a number of excavations took place here in the late 20th century, and they unearthed this palace that has been called the Red Palace, because some of the residual paint still survives from the walls of the palace, those partial walls that survive. What's really interesting about the Red Palace is that we continue to see all kinds of writings in the Red Palace from the Babylonian period. These writings are written in traditional Assyrian style cuneiform. And with the exception that the regnal years are calculated based on either Nabopolassar or Nebuchadnezzar, who are the two Babylonian kings, as opposed to the regnal years of the prior Assyrian kings, there is nothing that would tell you about what has been discovered there, that the Babylonians were in charge and the Assyrians were not, right? They're using the same language, they're talking about the same kinds of terms, and the Babylonian language and Assyrian languages are different enough that such a difference would become obvious. We also have a number of statues of Ashur, the chief god of the Assyrians, that come from this period. And in addition to having statues of the god Ashur, we also have people using the word Ashur in their name or other very typical Assyrian names, even in Babylonian documents. This is a map of the world from Sippar. And Sippar, this particular document doesn't have any Assyrian names on it. It's just really beautiful to look at because you can see the Babylonian map of the world at the bottom. But Sippar has been an archaeological reservoir with numerous Assyrian names and dates and land holdings that have been saved in the cuneiform tablets that we have recovered. One of the other very interesting things is that the last king of Babylon, this King Nabonidus, he doesn't seem to have any connection to the dynasty that preceded him. He's very clear that his mother is Assyrian ethnically. His father may well have also been Assyrian ethnically. And he makes a number of key changes to Babylonian internal policy that would seem to be in line with him being ethnically Assyrian and somewhat proud of that heritage. The first one is that he rebuilds the temple of Sin. Sin was a primary god of the Assyrians right after Ashur. And so he rebuilds that temple in Haran. This actually was the same temple of Sin where Ashur-uballit II, the last king of Assyria, was coronated is an imprecise term because technically it wasn't a coronation. It would have to take place in the temple of Ashur in Nineveh for it to be a proper coronation. But Ashur-uballit II was recognized as king of the Assyrians in the Temple of Sin. So the renovation of that temple was key in connecting back to Assyrian roots. And conversely, Nabonidus destroyed or minimized the importance of a number of temples of Marduk, who was the chief god of the Babylonians. In many ways, he seems to have created an Assyrian cultural renaissance in the last days of the Babylonian Empire. You can see him commending Belshazzar, who would have been his prince and next king had he been succeeded, but that would not be the case because the Medes are going to intervene. And so we need to sort of, the Persians, are going to intervene, and we need to sort of figure out why that is. So we mentioned before, and you can see from the map on the right-hand side, that the Medes controlled a significant amount of territory. They controlled about a third of Anatolia and most of the western part of Iran and some parts of the Jazeera. Now, the Medes were ruled by a number of successive kings, and in 564 BCE, Astyages inherits the throne from Quaxares. We don't know much about the reign of Astyages. In fact, the name, of course, as you can see from its spelling, is the Greek name for this king. We have had there's an immense amount of difficulty finding the right equivalent name among the Medes that they would have used for him because we have no Median sources of his reign or his behaviors. What we do know, though, is that one of the territories that he controlled was the region of Fars. And that region of Fars, as you can see on the map, it was previously part of the territory of Elam, but came under Median control midway through the 6th century BCE. And this region of Fars is a very mountainous, hilly area and is the place where Persians come from. Pars, Fars are the two names of that region. So Pars became Persian. And Cyrus, who was the appointed king of this region of Fars, decided to rebel. Now, this may sound kind of surprising, that Cyrus would have the title of king if he was subordinate to Astyages. This is important in understanding Persian and, before them, Median understandings of power. The Medes were using the term king of kings, understanding or believing that their reign was full of numerous different countries within it, and those countries themselves had their own kings. So Astyages was king of kings, and Cyrus was a king. That said, in 550 BC, Cyrus the Great launched a rebellion, unseated his grandfather, and became ruler of the entire Median Empire, which he then renamed as the Persian Empire. The Persian term for this empire that he created was called Hashmonai, um, which in English has been rendered as Achaemenid, from the Greek. So when that empire expanded under Cyrus, Cyrus launched a war against the Lycians, who controlled the western half of Anatolia, and against the Babylonians. And when he conquered those territories, the Babylonian province of Jazira was called Athura. Athura, of course, being a version or pronunciation of Assur, or Ashur, became Athur. So now it became called Athura. And the Babylonians had called the territory on the western side of the Euphrates as Eber-Nari. Eber means over, Nari means river. So on the far side of the river, right? It's the same way that we call the region on the other side of the Caucasus Mountains Transcaucasia, right? It's on the other side. So we use those kinds of terms. The Babylonians did the same. So Eber-Nari was their term for Syria. And we also see some of the territory, right, of the Medes being called Mada, or right, and those provinces retained those names under Persian auspices. Now, Cyrus the Great is particularly famous for allowing the Jews to have returned back to their homeland in the southwest Levant and rebuild their secret temple, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. But it wasn't only the Jews who were allowed to rebuild their ancient structures. The Assyrians as well were given permission to build their temple of Ashur, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians. And while they didn't build a very large temple, as far as we can tell at this point, they did begin to venerate their own gods in the open. One of the interesting things is that we then begin to see, during the Achaemenid period, that the term Eber-Nari, to refer to the land on the western side of the Euphrates River, falls in disfavor. And the term Assyria or Assyria is used to refer to both sides of the Euphrates River, which would give some indication that the number of Assyrians was relatively high. And we do seem to see a dense number of villages populating the region at this time from the archaeological records. The switch from Assyria to Syria, right, which is the origin of the modern Syria, was already happening at this time. People were just dropping off that first A. So it became Syria. So it's worth taking a second to sort of delve into the Assyrian effect on the Achaemenid governorship. Now, of course, the Achaemenids were a Persian dynasty, as we pointed out, and the majority of their bureaucrats were Persian. That said, we know that we have we have Assyrians in the government. In particular, we know King Cambyses II had a secretary, Pan-Ashur-Limur. Pan-Ashur-Lumur is very clearly an Assyrian name. And we also know that there are other Assyrians, again, attested to in cuneiform from the period. Now, in particular, the picture you can see in the upper left of King Cambyses II admiring Amasis is considered in many ways a story similar to the Helen of Troy story, in that he wanted this woman, this beautiful Egyptian woman, and he was refused, so he invaded Egypt to get her, right? It's part of that justification of expansion. One of the interesting political things that we notice immediately is that there's a strong tie between the provinces of Athura and the province of Mada, right? The province where the Medes live. And Athura and Mada actually managed to revolt twice, in 546 and in 520. And when they revolt together. Typically, the provinces in the Achaemenid Empire, to the extent that they did revolt, they revolted separately, or at different times. So the fact that these two provinces not only revolted but revolted together suggests a highly a highly integrated situation between the peoples who were living in Mada and Athura, likely because the Assyrian population was dominant in both of those provinces. One of the other things that's worth pointing out is the language Aramaic, which was increasingly the language that the Assyrians were using, cuneiform having really fallen out of favor by the mid 500s CE. That Aramaic became useful as a dominant language within the Achaemenid Empire. And we can see it here. You have the Letton trilingual stela. This is a stela that was written in Persian, in Lycian, and in Aramaic, and discusses the situation of the fall of the Lycian kingdom to the Achaemenids. Now, we also know that Assyrians were involved in the art and architecture of the period. You can see this is part of the wall of Darius' palace in Susa in Iran. And not only have the Persians taken up the iconography of the Lamassu, right, with that winged lion with a head of a man, which was iconic on Assyrian palaces, but the actual process of coloring and firing the bricks that were used to assemble the palace, and the color and engraving that was done, those were done by Assyrians in Assyrian style. We also, as I pointed out, have the beginnings of the Temple of Ashur being rebuilt. And for example, this is a wash basin from an earlier period. We don't know what the Temple of Ashur looked like in this period, but it would have had similar kinds of wash basins as well. Finally, and this goes back to the Achaemenid belief that they were kings of kings, you can see the Assyrian soldier here at the tomb of King Xerxes. And at that tomb, he is holding up the lintel along with the other 20 nations that are represented. If you go back to lecture 22 in the series, you can see the Armenian soldier. And there are slight differences between the Assyrian soldier and the Armenian soldier. Speaking of soldiers, the Persian army assembled by the Achaemenids was representative of all the nations under the control of the Achaemenid dynasty. So you can see these are some Persian soldiers on the left-hand side, but the Assyrians fought with the Persians as well. And you can see this is a writing by Herodotus, which describes exactly how the Assyrians dressed in battle. The Assyrian contingent wore on their heads either bronze helmets or plated helmets of a peculiarly foreign design, which is hard to describe. Their shields, spears, and daggers resembled Egyptian ones, and they also carried wooden clubs with iron studs and war. So those wars that took place against Greece that Xerxes led, such as the Battle of Thermopylae, the Battle of Marathon, the assorted other land battles that took place, there were Assyrians represented in the Persian army at that time. Now, just to remind ourselves of what was going on the Armenian side, right? Armenia was also a province in the Achaemenid Empire, and they had their own revolt, but this was a revolt that was coordinated between the three satraps, the three governors of those provinces, Armenia, Cappadocia, and Lydia, and Phrygia, to come together. And this was one of those few situations that bucks the trend where multiple provinces erupted together with Egyptian support. When Alexander the Great conquered the Achaemenid Empire, he was succeeded by Seleucus, his chief general, in taking control of his Asian territories. And you can see the Seleucid period, and the Seleucid period is probably when we have the fewest number of our Assyrian evidences, but we still have a few. The first one is that when Alexander the Great was making coins, he wrote in Aramaic, which of course was the dominant language of the Achaemenid Empire. We also have the development of Osroene and Adiabene during this Seleucid period, and it's worth talking a little bit more about them, which we will do in due time. The enemies of the Seleucids were the Parthians. The Parthians were a nomadic Iranic people, somewhat related to the Scythians, who lived in what is today Turkmenistan, and they pushed the Seleucid Empire out of Persia through coming from the north and their nomadic horseman skills. Now, the Parthians were incredibly tolerant of the various peoples beneath them, and so this gave the possibility of a number of different states developing along their frontier with the Seleucids, who were pushed into Mesopotamia. So naturally, that frontier region, Mesopotamia, would give rise to a number of different states. Now, it's important to remember, and we talked about this in lecture number 3, there were a number of trade routes throughout the Middle East, starting in 700 BCE, but continuing throughout. And those trade routes went all the way down to Saba in modern-day Yemen and crisscrossed the Hijaz and Mesopotamia, bringing Arabs further north than just the Arabian Peninsula. And those Nabateans are the ones who built, for example, Petra in Jordan, and their soldiers expanded and conquered territories along those trade routes. That said, the fact that the Arab tribesmen were in control didn't mean that the majority of the population in those areas became Arab. So let's examine a little bit what this area looked like around the time of Jesus. So you can see these different titles and names for all these different regions, and these usually are the Greek names for those areas. But I wanted to expand a little bit, and so you can see on the right-hand side that there are 4 countries that we are going to look at. You have Osroene, you have Adiabene, Hatra, and Ashur. So Adiabene is the only one that is clearly an Assyrian kingdom. The rulers of Adiabene spoke Aramaic and were recognized as an Assyrian dynasty by their populations. Now, Adiabene expanded and contracted. Their capital was at Arbela, the modern city of Erbil, which is the capital of modern Kurdistan. And from Arbela, they expanded to the northwest. In fact, because of their loyalty to the Parthians, they were given the territories of Gordiene, which is part of southeastern Turkey today. So Adiabene its center was primarily located in Arbela, as we pointed out, and yeah, and so we're going to talk more about Adiabene as we move further in the chronology. At roughly this same time, we have the city of Osroene. Now, Osroene derives its name from Araha, Araha being the Arabic name for Edessa, the modern city of Urfa. So this is a kingdom that is centered on the city of Edessa. And you can see from the mosaics that were created in this period, the mosaics are also written in Aramaic, which shows that the Arabs who were ruling this area weren't ruling a primarily Arab-speaking population. They were ruling a foreign population, the population that was local to the region, they having been the ones who came from outside. And they promoted the cultural diversity of the region, allowing citizens from Rome, citizens from Armenia, and from Parthia to join in the kingdom, as well as allowing the Assyrian population to live freely there. We mentioned during the 22nd lecture that Tigranes the Great of Armenia conquered a number of territories during his kingdom, which was from 95 to 66 BC. And Osroene and Adiabene were both vassals during the reign of Tigran the Great. But as soon as Tigran the Great lost power, they became somewhat independent again, falling under the sway of the Parthians. Now, Osroene was close enough to Rome that the Romans thought that Osroene could be an ally of theirs. And so, in the lead up to the Battle of Carrhae, Marcus Crassus, the general on the Roman side, met up with King Abgar II of Osroene. And Abgar II brought Marcus Crassus right into the Parthian ambush that was set up for him near the city of Carrhae. Now you can see Carrhae is within the territory of Osroene as well. The thing is that the Romans had been hesitant about crossing the Euphrates and were going to try to go over the territory of the Kingdom of Armenia in order to get into the Parthian Empire. But because of Abgar II's suggestion, they went to Carrhae and were therefore ambushed by Orodes II of Parthia. The Parthians thoroughly defeated Marcus Crassus and even killed him in the battle, causing many of his troops to scatter. It was an incredible defeat for the Romans. Now, Assyria did become a Roman province because of Trajan's campaigns. He marched into the province in 116 and made Osroene and Adiabene client states of Rome. Now, Osroene became part of the region of Mesopotamia, and Adiabene became the province of Assyria. You can see the Romans are using the term Assyria to refer to that territory on the east bank of the Tigris River. And the Romans almost always used Syria or some version of Syria to refer to the western side, right? Remember that during the Achaemenid period, Syria was used for both sides of the Euphrates River. So the name Syria for the west bank of the river stuck during the Roman period and is the origin of the current country name of Syria today. That said, those territories were never held very strongly. We have coins with Trajan's imprimatur in Mesopotamia and in Armenia, but we do not have any in the territory of Assyria. In fact, we have almost no evidence the Romans were ever in Assyria because they were only there for 2 years, and they didn't build any permanent fortifications. So we mentioned Adiabene, Osroene. The last one, which is between the two, is Hatra. And Hatra was also controlled by Arabs, but we have many more clear instances of Assyrians in Hatra. Probably the easiest one to notice is the shrines. We have shrines to a number of different gods from different pantheons within Hatra. And in particular, one of the ones that stands out is that you have the Assyro-Akkadian god Nergal. Nergal was almost exclusively worshipped by Assyrians at this point in time. And so the presence of those worship places indicates that there was probably an Assyrian population there as well. Now, Hatra became wealthy because of its position at the edge of the Parthian Empire. You had numerous trade caravans along the Silk Road coming to Hatra and spending time at the city. Now, one of the things is that many of the places that I will be showing you pictures of are places that did not survive Islamic State between the years 2014 and 2019. Hatra is one of the few situations where that is not the case. This is the Temple of Mern, and the Temple of Mern exists more or less intact since Islamic State controlled this region. That said, many statues from Hatra, Adiabene, and Osroene were destroyed by Islamic State if they were still in the region. Now, during the Parthian period, right, where you have these three states, you also have the city-state of Ashur, and Ashur itself has very clear Assyrian heritage. The most famous ruler, because we have a stela of him, is Rehut Asur, and he ruled in the 2nd century CE. We also know that he was responsible for the rebuilding of the largest temple to Ashur that was ever built after the fall of ancient Assyria. And while this is Hatra, this is still from Hatra, it's believed that the temple of Ashur that he would have built would be similar. And you can see these sort of arches within the walls. This is a very typical Perso-Iranic technique. And so it would have naturally spread along the trade routes to affect the Assyrian style of building. And this technique is called Iwan, and you can see it in many of the Assyrian structures from this period as well. So we would expect that the Temple of Ashur would have this same development. I mentioned that we would talk about Adiabene, and this is where Adiabene gets interesting. After the reign of King Monobaz I, his wife, Helena, converted to Judaism, and she installed her son Izatis II onto the throne, and she then moved to Jerusalem, and where she built her own palace. Now, we know that she converted to Judaism because she met a rabbi in the city of Nusaybin, which at that time was called Nisibis. And after learning about Judaism from the rabbi and converting, she was instrumental in politics within Israel, which was, of course, Roman-controlled at the time. She facilitated trade between, was a Roman vassal at the time, because she was living around the year 35 to 50. So she facilitated trade between Israel and Egypt, and she also poured numerous sums into the coffers of the Jewish government, increasingly as that Jewish government was resisting Roman occupation. The accounts of what she did are recorded in the Jewish religious text, of the Talmud, specifically in the book of Bava Batra. And there are distinctions between the Jerusalemite Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, because the Jews maintained two different Talmuds based on the communities from which they arose. And there are some discrepancies between the Jerusalemite Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud concerning the stories of Queen Helena. Not that they contradict each other, but that they have different information. And the Jerusalemite Talmud talks more extensively about what Queen Helena did, naturally, because she was more involved with the situation in Jerusalem. That said, Judaism has been a part of the story in Assyria pretty much since this time, and until the 20th century with the Jewish exodus from Iraq. There were always Jews in the northern part of Iraq. Some of them, especially those who are on the further eastern part of Iraq and over onto the Iranian border, even spoke Aramaic, continued to speak Aramaic. And so there's a question about whether or not are um, those Jews are Assyrians who converted, or are simply Aramaic speaking Jews, because the Jews of Judea at this time, the Hasmonean kingdom, the Hasmonean kingdom in Israel at this time, were Aramaic speaking as well. And with Judaism came Christianity soon after. And it's theorized by many scholars in the field that the majority of early Christian converts within Assyria were converts from Judaism to Christianity. Now, there is the tale that King Abgar V of Hatra, King Abgar V of Osroene, had correspondence with Jesus, requesting Jesus to come to Osroene and bless him. Jesus responding that he had to do what he had to do in Palestine at the time, but he would send one of his disciples. And the disciple he sent was Mar Adai, Mar being the Aramaic word for saint. So Mar Adai came. However, this story is not vindicated by any archaeological evidence, and is likely a pastiche of several different things. The first is that Abgar VIII, who came about 100 years later, did convert to Christianity and made Hatra, at least nominally, a Christian accepting state. Another piece is that the story of the foundation of the Church of the East is that apostles Thomas, Thaddeus, and Bartholomew came from Judea and brought Christianity to Arbela, right, that capital city of Adiabene. And you can follow that on the map above. You can see they originate in Jerusalem, then they go to Damascus, then they go to Tadmor. Eventually, they get to the city of Hatra here. They get to the city of Ashur there, and even eventually to Arbela there. So you have this entry of Christianity into Assyria, and you start seeing Assyrian conversions. The Assyrian church is relatively unorganized for the first 200 or so years of its existence. And so while you have a nucleus of the Assyrian Christian community developing, it's very different than the situation, for example, in Armenia or Georgia, where the king will convert and then the entire population converts as well. And so you have this situation where the kings of Adiabene, Hatra, Ashur, and Osroene are slowly converting to Christianity, but they're not proclaiming it as a state religion. At the same time, you have bishoprics that are developing in these eastern areas. The first one is led by Bishop Bakida, and Bakida became the bishop of Arbela between the years of 104 and 114. We also see the translation of the Bible taking place, and the translation of the Bible into one language was first achieved by the Assyrians. There is, aside from the Koine Greek version that already existed, and the Peshitta, or the simplified Syriac version of the Bible, we know that it existed in some form or another by the year 180 CE, because there are references to it in discussions that are ongoing. This is long before the Vulgate, right, the Latin translation of the Bible. And it's unclear if the Peshitta was translated from the three original languages of the Bible, right, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Koine, or if it was translated directly from Koine alone. But it includes a number of books that didn't exist in the Septuagint, so leading credence to believe that it was translated from all the distinct languages. We also have the Diatessaron, and the Diatessaron is a very interesting book in that it tries to create a singular account of Jesus' life, merging the accounts of the four Gospels and trying to avoid their contradictions. The Diatessaron is the earliest attempt by any Christian group to try to square this circle and create a singular account. While we don't have the original Aramaic versions of the Diatessaron, we have translations of it in Arabic still today, and so it's possible to translate that back into Aramaic as well as into other languages. Now, the Parthians would lose power to another Persian group, right? We mentioned that the Parthians were Persianate, meaning that they spoke a language that was similar to Persian, but they didn't speak Persian itself. The Sassanians are a completely different story, and they start in the region of Fars, similar to Cyrus the Great, and they see themselves as being the next empire after the Achaemenids to really be a Persian empire. It's also worth pointing out that the Sassanids, unlike the Parthians, were religiously inclined, and I think that's saying it lightly. Many have portrayed them as zealots, and that's because the House of Sassan was a group of Zoroastrian priests. And so they tried to rule their country as a Zoroastrian theocracy led by Ardashir I, the king of kings, who built his palace in Firuzabad. He also created the Deccan, right? We've talked about them numerous times. The Deccan are the nobility of Persia and were exclusively Zoroastrian as well. This created a problem as Christianity began to expand within the territories of that the Sassanids were trying to control. The Sassanids were religiously evangelistic of the Zoroastrian faith, and also they saw Christianity as being connected directly to Rome, who would be the enemy and refuse to permit the Sassanids to continue conquering territories in Mesopotamia, including the Jazeera. And so we have a number of discriminations against the Christians, as long as it can be seen, or at least perceived, that those Christians could be a fifth column during a Roman invasion of Sassanid Persia. In particular, we see the destruction that occurs when the Sassanids move far enough out to bring all of these Parthian vassal states, Osroene, Adiabene, Hatra, and Ashur, under Sassanid control. In particular, we don't know the date when it occurred. It could have been during Ardashir's first invasion or Ardashir's second invasion of Mesopotamia, 228 or 241 respectively. Regardless, Ardashir I defeated Artabanus IV, the last king of the Parthians, and as part of that defeat, he made sure to destroy Ashur, which had been a loyal ally of the Parthians because of the religious freedom given to them, and the city was burned and sacked. So it's worth taking a second to remember that the Christianity that develops in the East is different than the Christianity that develops in Rome. And there's a reason for that. There are a number of different local bishops, and then they come to their own perspectives on how the relationships exist between the members of the Trinity and Jesus's personal nature. Now, one of the leading Christian bishops in the East was a man by the name of Nestorius. And Nestorius had a disagreement with a number of the other bishops, especially those from the Roman Empire, and that disagreement was as follows. The bishops of the Roman Empire wanted to call Mary by the term Theotokos, which in Greek means God-bearer. in that within her womb sat uh, Jesus Christ, and Jesus, of course, was God, right? Jesus has two natures, human nature and a divine nature, and those natures necessarily existed when Jesus was in the womb. And so, therefore, the term Theotokos, God bearer, was the proper way to refer to the Blessed Virgin. Nestorius disagreed. Nestorius believed that no person could contain the majesty that is God. Only God could contain the majesty that is God. And so while Jesus himself was, of course, completely God and completely man, he could not have been that way while still in the body of his mother. So this union of divine nature and human nature that occurred in the person of Christ only occurred at the moment of birth. That moment of union is called the hypostasis, or the hypostatic union. So the Nestorius said that the hypostatic union occurred at the moment of birth, whereas the majority of bishops, especially those coming from the Roman Empire, claim that it occurred during conception. So accordingly, Nestorius refused to use the name Theotokos and instead used the term Christotokos, Christ bearer. Regardless, this disagreement, which of course seems very trivial to us today, was enough to excommunicate the church led by Nestorius and those who felt as he did. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that when we talk about most of the churches of the East, the Oriental Orthodox traditions, like the Armenian Church, like the Ethiopian Tawhedo Church, like the Coptic Church, they didn't agree with Nestorius. They agreed with the Romans on this question of hypostatic union. But what they disagreed about was the nature of the relationship between the human and divine elements of Christ, right? Was it miaphysitic, meaning that there was really one inseparable nature with two theoretically distinct components? Think salt water, right? It has salt and it has water, but you can't really separate them, and salt water doesn't really make sense without the salt or the water. Or is it diaphysitic? Are they two things that together make one complete whole, and the idea cannot be separated conceptually, but the things actually could be distinct and identified? Think like an oil slick, right? You've got the oil, you've got the water, the two don't mix, but the concept of an oil slick doesn't make sense unless you have both the oil and the water. In contrast to the other Oriental Orthodox churches, the Church of the East agreed with the diaphysitic position, which was the dominant position of Rome, and disagreed with the Oriental Orthodox position of miaphysitism, that saltwater position. So it created a very interesting situation because the Church of the East wasn't connected to any other church that existed elsewhere. So as you can see, the break-off point, the Assyrian church, the Church of the East is in yellow here, right? You can see the break-off point from the Ecclesia, the early church, is at the Council of Ephesus in 431, as opposed to at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Now, as the Sassanids expanded westward into Mesopotamia and the eastern part of Anatolia, we see many more Christians come under Sassanian rule, and we see Sassanian deportations of Christians further east so that those people can help build the Sassanian economy. The Sassanians built many cities. Ardashir and Shapur II were very famous for this, as well as Shapur I, building numerous cities, creating massive infrastructure, and the population of Sassanid Persia blossomed tremendously, helped in part by these deportations. That said, these deportations also came with a number of persecution. Shosha II was particularly famous for how badly he persecuted the Christians during his reign. But that changed by the time of Shah Yazdegerd I, who decided to take a completely different route. And in 410, he convened what was called the Council of Seljuk Ctesiphon, Ctesiphon being the capital of the Sassanid kingdom while he was alive, and very close to where Baghdad is now. And so you can see the Take Kasra, which was the main sort of town hall, if you can call it that, of Ctesiphon. And there, he held a council, and this council was in repudiation of the councils that were being held in the West. Now, notice that this council in 410 actually precedes the Council of Ephesus by 21 years, but it doesn't precede the first two ecumenical councils, the Council of Ephesus being the third. And the Council of Seleucia Ctesiphon has never been counted among the ecumenical councils because only those Christians within the Sassanid Empire actually showed up. At this council, the view of Nestorius was promulgated as the central view, and within Seleucia Ctesiphon, the Church of the East was founded in its proper name with its own bishops and leadership. The leadership being the Mar, or saint. Now, Yazdegerd I, for having created this toleration for Christianity and recognizing it, among other issues with his reign, got him into a lot of hot water with the Parthian nobles. Now, it seems kind of strange because the Parthians were defeated already over 200 years ago, but the Parthians actually remained a part of the Sassanid bureaucracy. You had the Dekhans, the nobles that had been promoted by the Sassanids themselves, and you had the Parthians who retained their nobility. And the Parthian nobles conspired to assassinate Yazdegerd I, and you can see this picture from showing Yazdegerd the first. He's in yellow, being kicked by his white horse, resulting in his death. After Yazdegerd I, Assyrians and other Christians within the empire continued to be the subject of persecution. It's worth pointing out that the split between Eastern and Western churches in the Chalcedonian world didn't have that much of an effect on the Assyrian church until the 1500s, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Now, one of the things we talked about with Armenia, and it holds true for Assyria as well, is the devolution of power that occurred in the region. So one of the key things that happened was that the Parthians had permitted a lot of those states to be somewhat independent. That was not the case under the Sassanids, who appointed Marzban, or chief commanders, and Nakharar, noble families. And those Marzban and Nakharar would be the ones in control of the various regions within the Persian Empire that were in the Jazeera. Now, Armenia managed to have a significant degree of autonomy. Syria did not. And so you begin to have persecution of both Armenian Christians and Assyrian Christians. And we talked about the Armenians who fought at the Battle of Avaraer, which was led by Vardar Mamikonian. That led to the death of Mamikonian and a number of his other leaders. And you have the subsequent battle in 484 of the Battle of Navarsak, where Vahan Mamikonian, no relation, was able to prevail over the Sassanids at Divin. So in both cases, in the case of the Armenians and the Assyrians, the reason for their persecution under Yazdegerd II seems to be that he fought with the Hephthalites on the eastern borders of the empire, as well as with the Kidarites. And he believed that Christians were responsible for his losses in those wars because the cavalry divisions that he depended on were made of Armenian and Iberian, i.e., Georgian, cavalry, both of whom were Christian. And so he persecuted Christians regardless of national affiliation. And it's reputed by Assyrian scholars that 153,000 Assyrian scholars from the time, sorry, that 153,000 Assyrians were massacred in the year 448. Um, there's a question about is there a mention of Persian or Mountain Jews who fought on the side of the Sassanids? Um, the Jews generally were on the side of the Sassanids. The biggest Sassanid Jewish alliance was in 614 during the Byzantine Sassanian War. And the Sassanids saw the Jews as possible allies in fighting the Byzantines in what's today the state of Israel. In terms of the battles with the Armenians, I'm not familiar with a Jewish contingent fighting on the Persian side. Despite the fact that we have these numerous persecutions going on, we also have a flowering of Assyrian culture in between those volleys, especially as you move later into the Sassanid period. And there's a flowering for two reasons. The first one is the large distance evangelism, which we'll talk about. But the next is the influx of Christians that are coming in from the Byzantine Empire, because while Rome persecuted a number of different Christian groups for not being Orthodox, within the Sassanid Empire, any form of Christianity was equally good or bad, depending on how the ruler perceived it. And the fact that you'd have a number of Christians who were naturally antagonistic towards Rome was something that the Sassanids were willing to approve of. In particular, after Nestorius was ruled heretical in 431 in the Council of Ephesus, a number of Christians came to him to study who had been his followers in the Roman Empire and were now suffering persecution. This resulted in a number of successive schools being formed, leading to eventually the School of Nisibis, which was built in 358. Now, the School of Nisibis was a religious seminary, and the building that survives is only one wing of the very large seminary that existed. It resulted in numerous copies of the Peshitta being created, missionaries being formed, standardization in forms of the bishopric, and the increase in conversion of Assyrians to Christianity, such that by the 5th century CE, we no longer see Jews or polytheists in any serious numbers existing within the Assyrian highlands. We also have the creation of the Mor Gabriel Monastery. Now, of course, it's been expanded over time, so the current structure, which you can see there, is significantly more than was originally built, but it was originally built by the ascetics in this period. You also have a number of Assyrian cultural developments that occur during this period. The first one is what's called Soma Ba'utha, or the fast of I'm trying to think of a good translation. The fast of penitence. And Soma Ba'utha develops in the 500s when during a particularly bad situation, one of the Assyrian priests decides to lead a fast. And this fast is in commemoration of the fast that Jonah had asked the Assyrians to perform to cleanse them of their wicked deeds in the book of Jonah. After the fast, the troubling conditions ended, and so there's been an Assyrian tradition to continue this fast as one of their cultural signposts, connecting them in that way to the book of Jonah. You also have Assyrians in this period writing about their own history. You can see Saint Afrahat. Saint Afrahat is often called the Persian sage, but despite that title, he wasn't Persian at all. And Afrahat is one of our best sources for the history of the early Assyrian Christianity, and he documents a number of the persecutions, especially those of Shapur II that we just talked about. There's a question: was there a break in churches, and did the Greek Orthodox Church already rule in? I assume that's Byzantium. The Greek Orthodox Church was part of the unified church, right? The unified church that would break into the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Church. That schism wouldn't happen until 1054. So Constantinople was still part of the unified church at this point in time, even though the Oriental Orthodox churches and the Church of the East were outside of communion with the unified church. Within Constantinople, the emperor was the leader of ceremonies, and there was sort of an understanding between the Pope being the leader in Rome, the emperor in Constantinople being the leader in Constantinople, and there were three other cities that led together, called the Pentarchy: Alexandria, led by the Coptic Pope, Antioch, which had its own pope, and its own leader, and Jerusalem, which had its own leader. So I mentioned the evangelism, and we see this throughout this period. The first evangelism that supposedly occurred was that of Saint Thomas the Apostle, who, after founding the church in Arbela, went to India and founded the church there. And you can see members of the Syro-Malabar Church on the upper right-hand side. On the flip side, we have Nestorian missionaries trained in the school of Nisibis, going all the way to all the way to central and western China. And in fact, we have the Nestorian stele, which is from 781. So in the beginning of the Islamic period, but still when this was still possible. And this Nestorian stele talks about Christianity and is one of the earliest references to Christianity in China. And we see during this period a significant conversion to Christianity in the regions along the Silk Road. It was certainly not the majority religion. Buddhism was much more prevalent and would remain so until Islam arose. But Christianity did make a number of inroads, and you can see the development of a number of metropolitan sees outside of Mesopotamia, right? You can see the ones in eastern Iran and those that lead into Central Asia. Not only that, the Assyrian Aramaic alphabet became the base point for a number of other alphabets, and you can see a little bit more of that here. You can see the Mathnahaya alphabet of the Syrians on the upper left-hand side, which inspired the Sogdian writing. And you can see the similarity; it's just rotated 90 degrees. And the Sogdian writing gave rise to Mongolian writing. And the Mongolian alphabet that you see there is still used today in China. And there are debates in independent Mongolia as to whether this alphabet should be revived, given that Mongolia wants to distance its relationship with Russia. And currently they use the Cyrillic alphabet to represent Mongolia. So this also shows the degree of cultural ascendancy that the Assyrians had through this promulgation of Christianity. We also see that the Christianity that they were promulgating made its way to the Arabs in the southern part of the Persian Empire. The Lakhmids based at Al-Hira, were known to be Church of the East, and the Ghassanids were believed to also be similarly inclined. You had Jews and Christians throughout Arabia, and many of the Christianities that existed in Arabia were other heresies that had been purged from the Byzantine Empire. Some of them, including Jacobites, which were a form of the Church of the East. If we remember, the Ghassanids and Lakhmids were vassal tribes of the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, respectively, and kept their borders on the south safe. And then, of course, we have the Third Byzantine Sassanian War, which was devastating to all parties involved. But as you can see, because you can see Nisibis on the map, between Nisibis and Tesfon is really the region where you have the densest population of Assyrians. And this was the region that was directly fought over in the war. The Sassanians made a number of gains early in the war, but the Byzantines ended up taking that territory towards the end. And so you had a number of casualties and burnt cities along the way. This led to the Islamic conquest of the region, which was solidified by 637. So you can see on this map here, which shows the Armenians being able to get independence by the mid-800s. During that period, all of the territories of the Jazeera, which is just south of that circle, you can see the Tigris and the Great Zab, all those territories were still part of the Abbasid Caliphate, and you really didn't have any independence for Assyria. Then we begin to see the breakup of the Abbasid Caliphate. We remember, and we discussed this primarily during episode 7, that you had those Mawali, or non-Arab peoples, rising up and taking power. And so you had the creation of numerous states, right? Like the Buyids, for example, are Dalamite Persians. The Salarids are Turks. Are Perso-Iranians. The Sajids are another Iranic group, and these groups end up taking territory from the Abbasids, who are reduced to the city of Baghdad as a ceremonial government more than a terrestrial government. They were an ecclesiastical government. Now, during this period, especially as we move closer to the year 1000, we see the development of Kurdish states, which is kind of surprising since we haven't seen Kurds before. Now, the term Kurd, as we mentioned last time, originally just meant a nomadic person. The fact that it being used to refer to a specific ethnic group starts in the Abbasid period. And by the later Abbasid period, as you have that Iranian intermezzo, with the collapse of Abbasid direct power, you begin to have these Kurdish statelets form. Now, we don't know that much about their internal policy, and some, like the Anazids, left almost nothing behind in terms of artistic contribution or in terms of ethnic contribution. It seems that the population, for example, of the Anazid state was everything but Anazid. You had Lurs, you had Persians, you had Assyrians, you had Babylonians, and other minority populations. Other states, like the Rawadids and the Shaddadids, did leave a lot more behind. For example, you can see the Shaddadid Manuchir Mosque, which is towards the westernmost area of their territory, in the city of Ani, which would eventually become the Armenian capital city in the around the year 1000. Now, the Shaddadids were in constant war with the Armenians living just to their north and west. And the relationships were always as feudal states under Abbasid auspices. So the Abbasids would give legal permission for these different states to form, and and the Abbasid Caliph decided to accept the existence of a Christian Armenian state. So you then had those different states fighting between each other, although both were nominally subordinate to the Abbasid Caliphate. Another Kurdish state where we have more historical evidence of their internal politics are the Rawadids, who controlled what is today northwestern Iran along the Aras River. And we know about their burial places. You can see the Chahar Minar, which is the burial place of the Rawadid rulers. And we know the Rawadids were actually Kurdified, which means that was a process that could happen. The original family was Arab and Arabic speaking, but they eventually, when they moved into the Zagros Mountains, they began to speak more and more the Kurdish languages. And so they became identified as Kurds. And when they ruled as Kurds. They also increased the number of Kurds in that area of the Zagros Mountains. But the majority of the population under their control during the first part of their reign was Iranic. But after the Turkish invasion, and we'll sort of talk about that, in the mid 1000s, they had a mixed population. As I mentioned, Ani became the Armenian city, and you can see the Armenians pushed further south into the territory that was controlled by some of these other tribes. You can see the Marwanids just to their south. And where the Sajids would be succeeded by the Salarids, and the Salarids by the Rawadids. So as the Byzantines moved further west, they removed the Armenians, but it would be the Turks who would completely remove the Byzantine presence from Anatolia. So you had the Seljuk invasion, and that invasion was really secured by the Battle of Manzikert. Manzikert was actually just north of the Kurdish state, right? The Kurdish Marwanid state. The transition from Turkish overlordship, the transition from being loyal to the Abbasid Caliph to being loyal to the Turkish Sultanate didn't actually change, because as we remember from when we talked about the Seljuks, we talked about them a lot in episode 10. No, sorry. In episode 10. A lot of the territories of the Seljuks were divided into beyliks, into principalities. And so these Kurdish statelets fit in perfectly with this Turkish system. The Turks also gave permission for religious minorities to continue practicing as they were, which meant that the Assyrian churches, while would not be maintained necessarily in the best of conditions, were permitted to continue as they were. And so we have these varying maps all during this period, which show the numerous different Atabegs and subordinate entities that resulted from this interchange. Now, if we're looking for Kurdish states during the 12th century, they really recede. And you can see only really 2 Kurdish states on this entire map, which shows a number. You can really only see 2 Kurdish states on this map, which shows a number of different entities, right? You've got Christian entities in this sort of light orange color. You have Shirvan here, which was an Iranic entity. You have a number of different Iranic and Armenian states in this yellow color. You've got Turkic states in different colors. You have Crusader states here in the gray. But the only 2 Kurdish states are the Shaddadids, who still control Ani, right? That's when they built that mosque that I showed you on the earlier page, and the Rawand and the Rawanids are controlling Gilan, and that's about it. And of course, the Shaddadids had two different rival regimes, so you have another Shaddadid regime there. But generally speaking, the Kurds are now out of power, and the power is now with Turkic leaders. This would have an interesting shift. You have the Zengids, led by Nuruddin Zengi, and the Zengids are a Turkic dynasty, but they have in their employ a number of Kurds. And so during their intervention in what I call the War of Egyptian Succession, and of course, if you want to learn more about that, there's both the Crusader series on this channel, or you could go to episode 12, 11 and 12 discuss it. And this is a war between the Crusader state of Jerusalem and the Zengids over control of the decaying Fatimid Caliphate, which had ruled Egypt at the time. Now, the chief lieutenant that Nuruddin Zengi sent to represent him was a man by the name of Shirkuh, meaning Lion of the Mountain. And Shirkuh had a nephew, that nephew, of course, being Saladin. Saladin was able to not only replace Shirkuh as the dominant leader of the Zengid forces, he was also able to abolish the Fatimid Caliphate and become the first Sunni Sultan of Egypt since that territory was taken over by the Fatimids. Saladin also expanded his state from Egypt to the Levant region, to Hijaz, and really minimized the territory of the Crusader states, such that by the time of his death, the Crusader states were limited to those areas in the circles on the right-hand side. Now, it's worth pointing out that Saladin wasn't ruling as a Kurd in a tribal Kurdish area, right? We've seen with the Marwanids, with the Rawadids, with the Shaddadids, usually the most identifiable feature of being a Kurdish leader is just that, being a Kurdish leader, and maybe you had some Kurdish population below you, and you would rule as sort of a tribal confederation. That was not what Saladin did. Saladin was much more interested in Islam as a unifying and Muslim as a unifying entity, and so he was able to include many different groups of Muslims under his banner. Most of his soldiers were Turkic. You can see Muzaffaruddin Gokberi, and Gokberi was an enemy turned subordinate who fought on his side. You also have Ismatuddin Khatun, who was another Turkic woman who he took as his wife in order to inherit her territories. And by and large, he included Arabs as well in his governance and organization, which meant that when he made triumphs, like his conquest of Jerusalem in 1187, they were triumphs for all of Islam, not for a Kurdish state. Now, he left a dynasty to succeed him, and we talked about that dynasty in more detail in episodes 12 and 13. But suffice it to say, they didn't even speak Kurdish among each other. They spoke Turkish or Arabic. And if we go back to those maps, you can see in the fourth map at 1175, you have the Ayyubid Sultanate in control and visible there. All right. So it's worth talking also about the development of Kurds in terms of their religious orientation. And it's worth remembering that the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was really the place where you have this ideological flourishing that will slowly filter back to the Kurdish regions. Now, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was a Turkic Echo, turn off. Um, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome was one of the numerous different states of the Seljuks that had broken off from the Great Seljuk Empire and become its own thing. However, most Turks considered culture to have come from Iran, and so they brought over a number of Sufi mystics like Jalaluddin Rumi in order to cultivate a Sufistic orientation. And that Sufistic orientation was codified in the city of Konya, where we see a number of non-Islamic things, right, in the strictest sense, becoming very dominant and popular. Probably the most easy to see, if you look on the lower right-hand side, is that these are tiles from Kubadabad, sorry, Kubadabad Palace. And Kubadabad was built during this period by the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome. And the people who built it were Muslims, Sunni Muslims, but you can see that they have depictions of human beings, which, of course, most Sunni Muslims today will tell you is off limits. But during this sort of period of mysticism and Sufism, you began to see this kind of development. And you especially saw it in the eastern parts of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. You had things like amulets, and you had Turks who were drinking wine, both things that are prohibited under Islam. And so when these leaders launched their revolts, they launched their revolts getting Kurds to fight alongside them in order to expand their power. But at the same time, this led to ideological assimilation. And you begin to see the development of what I like to call post-Islamic religions. These are religions that are based to some degree on Islamic doctrine or arise from Islam, but are now sufficiently different in order for us to notice that they are not a version of Islam anymore. And they generally have four different characteristics that really differentiate them from Islam in general. The first is that some of them suggest that there are prophets after Muhammad. None of the religions that we're going to talk about today will assert that, but a number of post-Islamic religions do, like Baha'i that we talked about 2 lessons ago in episode 36. A number of them venerate Ali, considering him a special representative, and somehow quasi-divine or connected to the divine. Most of them have some sort of syncretic or reinterpretive aspect to them as well. And finally, a lot of all the ones that we're going to discuss today have batinia, or the belief that the physical reality is not what is paramount. What is paramount is the spiritual reality that we have to uncover. So we've talked about the Alevis before. Alevism was popular among both Turks and Kurds in the eastern part of Turkey. Those who rose up with Baba Ishaq, for example, that we just saw 2 slides ago, would have been oriented towards Alevism, even if they weren't Alevis themselves. And Alevism really strides the border between Islam and a post-Islamic religion, because it builds on a number of things within Shiite Sufi Islam. The first one is the concept of the pir, and the pir is the elder, the elder who is transmitting the tradition to his followers. Each pir will have a group of acolytes that will learn from him, and one of these pirs that was particularly famous was Haji Bektash Veli. And so Haji Bektash, those who saw him as being connected through the divine were the ones who became Alevis. Those who saw him strictly as a spiritual leader became Bektashis. Bektashis are still considered within the fold of Islam, although their presence there is sort of at the edge as well. So I would say Alevis are just on the other side, and Bektashis are just on the Islamic side. But there are a lot of disagreements over that. Alevis in modern Turkey face a number of death threats. That said, there are a number of cemevi, or whole houses of worship for Alevis. And the Alevis believe that Ali ibn Abi Talib was himself a version or a connection to God, that his purity allowed him to connect with God and demonstrate that. So while it's not saying that Ali is God, but that Ali is something from which the divine emanates. And you'll see that a lot of these doctrines that relate to Batiniya, relate to this sort of below the surface nature of things, will make assertions like this that make a distinction between what we see as a person and what we feel or what we connect to on that higher plane of existence. And the goal of the practicing Alevi is to connect to that reality, that higher batin, hidden reality. You can see the service in the middle of the Cemevi, and there you have the pir whirling, and he is surrounded by a number of worshippers who are trying to connect with him in that spiritual, emotional place. And so you have something very similar to what you may sort of imagine in sort of a Native American powwow, where you have this sort of spiritual moment that is occurring more than just a literal dogmatic one. You also have the religion of Yarsanism, or Ahle Haq, the people of truth, that develop. The Yarsan religion breaks with a number of Islamic tenets. Of course, we talk about the Batiniya, but we also have this idea of the Mudahariyat. Mudahariyat are appearances or apparentialisms. And according to the Yarsani, God has made himself manifest in the human world on 4 different periods of time. And the most recent one of these was in the personage of Sultan Sahak, who was a Kurdish leader in the 14th century. Now, Sultan Sahak, like many religious leaders, has a birth story that is rather apocryphal. It's believed that his mother, who was also Mudahariya, ate a pomegranate seed, and that seed slipped into her womb, allowing her to become inseminated with Sultan Sahak. Therefore, he was conceived in a virgin birth. Now, as the last Mudahiriya, he is a person of great importance, and his tomb is often visited by Yarsanis who wish to achieve his spiritual plane and connection. Another thing is that in the third of these Mudahariyat, there were 7 personages who arose, these Haftan, or 7 personages, who were collectively the appearance of God. And prior to that, in the second set of appearances, you have Ali ibn Abi Talib, right? So in many cases, because Ali has so much of the divine connected to him, the religion has been called Ali Ilahi, or Ali being God. Now, the Yarsanis will argue, similar to the Alevis, that Ali is not God in their tradition, only that Ali is the physical manifestation that our eyes perceive. But the true nature of Ali is that is that he was simply a manifestation of God's essence, in a way that we could perceive and understand. So it's not that God became a person, but that Ali was never a person in the first place. One of the interesting things about Yarsani in comparison to Islam is that it believes in reincarnation. Now, there are post-Islamic religions that we'll see that believe in reincarnation, like the Baha'i. But even in the Baha'i world, reincarnation has something to do with a journey in heaven, or a journey in hell, um, that exists in oscillation. The Yarsani believe that the reincarnation is almost immediate, in much the same way, um, in much the same way as you would see in an Eastern religion. But what is truly the experience that sort of centers Yarsani religious faith is the gem. So you can see a picture of the gem there. In a gem, men, and it's only men who are allowed to participate in a gem. They're seated in a rectangle, and their seats are specifically chosen. They are not allowed to sit in any other seat or to move when the gem has started. And they will play the tanbur, which is that sort of ukulele-looking instrument that they're all holding. And while they are sitting there for an hour, they will chant together and play together. And this chanting and playing is an invocation of the divine and a creation of a different mentality, a way to expose the batinia to reality. Now, while they are in the gem, those who are not invited, those who are not pure enough to participate, as well as women and children, are allowed to stand on the outside and partake in the creation of this beautiful moment, and the spiritual connection that it has. Given that Ahl Haq, or Yarsan, is a post-Islamic religion and it has a strong veneration of Ali, it has been persecuted throughout much of its history. And much of Yarsani history has been hiding in the mountains and hiding further in the mountains to avoid being detected. In the 20th century, that was less possible than in previous centuries, and so Yarsani have suffered particularly harshly in the 20th century. Almost all Yarsani believers are Kurds. This is different from Alevism in that most Alevi are Turks, but there are a significant minority of Kurds where it's like 40%, 60%. Yarsan is almost exclusively a Kurdish faith. Another faith that's worth talking about is Yazidism. And Yazidism is hard to explain exactly. The first part that's worth understanding is that they also believe in this idea of mudahiriya, of apparentialism, of appearances. But they believe that the appearances are those of Tavus Melek, or the peacock angel, I guess you could call him. Now, Tavus Melek came into history as Sheikh Adi, and you can see Sheikh Adi Shamieh Kure Musafiri in the center. That was his main incarnation, and then he will have a final incarnation at the end of days. But those three appearances result in the person or the thing to which most Yazidi dedicate their worship. Now, Tavus Melek is a little difficult to explain, but I'm going to try my best to sort of go through what he is. So in the beginning, according to the Yazidi, God created the universe, but that God created a sea of cosmicness, a cosmic ocean. And this ocean is called the Enzel. And in the Enzel, there is a formless void from which one pearl sprung. And that pearl within the entire cosmic ocean became the universe. Now the creator God himself took no interest in anything to do with the Enzel or anything to do with the universe itself. And so it fell upon the archangels in order to organize it. And one of these archangels was Tavus Melek. And Tavus Melek, therefore, was commanded by God, as well as the other archangels were commanded by God, to bow before man. And Tavus Melek refused to do so. The other archangels did. And because Tavus Melek refused to bow down, arguing that how could he bow down to something of the creator divinity didn't spend his time actually engaging with, he was considered the one to whom mankind should worship. Now, the similarity of that story to the Islamic account of Iblis, where the devil himself was the only angel that refused to bow down to humans, meant that for a lot of Yazidi history, and it still continues today, the Yazidi are considered devil worshippers by a number of Muslims. That said, it couldn't be further from the truth. Tavus Melek uh, is the intervening entity, um, is the intervening entity that actually improves the world and gives the world meaning. And it gave the world direct meaning through the acts of Sheikh Adi. Now, now we also see the Yazidi organizing as chieftains, are organizing under chieftains and in specific tribes. Now, there is a debate within the Yazidi community and the community outside the Yazidi as to whether the Yazidi are Kurds or not. They certainly only speak Kurdish languages and they only come from Kurdish tribes. But because of the religion being closed and because of the consistent persecution from both Kurds and non-Kurds, right? Yazidi have considered themselves an ethno-religious group in much the same way that Jews or Assyrians do. So one of the funny things that sort of develops as a part of history is that when Westerners first encountered Yazidism in the 19th century, they wanted to find out what the holy book of Yazidism was. In their paradigm, as they understood it, every religion has a holy book. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Every religion whose speakers have some form of writing would have a holy book. And so um, they found the Kitab Jilwa, which you can see a page of on the right-hand side. That said, most scholars believe that the Kitab Jilwa is a forgery. In truth, Yazidis don't have any strong holy book or connection. Their writings are primarily in the form of poetry that is recited and sung. Many of these are called qawl, or speech. And these recited poems reveal the information of the batini, right? That's secretive information about the nature of reality, because the Yazidi also believe in batinia. The Yazidi also have a number of distinct holidays that they don't share with any of the people around them. Most Iranic people celebrate Nowruz, which is usually celebrated on the first day of spring, and is the Persian New Year. The Yazidi have their own New Year, Charshama Sere Nisane, or the first of Nisan, and that holiday is usually celebrated around April 14th. Specifically, it's the first Wednesday after April 14th. And you can see these are some Yazidi women from Lalish who are lighting candles in anticipation of the new year beginning. Many Yazidi also go to the shrines of their ancestors, and particularly the shrine of Sheikh Adi is a site of pilgrimage. And there they also perform tawaf, which is a form of ritual procession around these tombs in order to gain the spiritual abilities to a lesser extent, but the spiritual abilities of the Sheikh buried in there. Yazidi also believe that they are reincarnated and that every Yazidi today was a Yazidi before, and accordingly, the religion is generally closed to conversion. And finally, the last religion that we see among the Kurds is the Shabak religion. And the Shabak religion is incredibly poor in terms of numbers. Today, there are less than 100,000 Shabak alive. And you can see this is an Iraqi Shabak family today. The Shabak, like the Alevis, are organized in peer groups, right? The peer being that elder who will transmit the tradition and the followers and acolytes that will surround the peer. What distinguishes the Shabaks from the Alevis is, first of all, they don't have a strong emphasis on Ali to the degree that the Alevis do. Their emphasis is shifted actually to Shah Ismail, the first of the Safavids, who reigned in the 1500s. And so the Shabak faith is probably a leftover remnant of the Kizil Bosh, right? Those Shiite extremists, and I say extremists in the sense that they took the religion to extreme, um, who remained in the north of Iraq. Now, Kizilbash were typically Turkic, but Shabak tend to be Kurdish. So the question, of course, became how did that tradition translate? How did the Shabak take on those features? And for the most part, we don't actually know. But within Safavid Persia, which the Shabak were west of, there was an aspect of 12er Shiite Islam that tried to remove the extremist elements of the Kizilbash that formed the early Safavid state. But within Iraq, that didn't happen, which is why Shabakism basically follows the original ghulu or extremist version of Shiite Islam promoted by the Kizilbash. So it's worth pointing out that the next periods in Middle Eastern history focus on those of the Mongol invasions. And where the Mongol invasions really come to the fore in this region is with the invasions of Anatolia, where a number of groups are attacked, but the Kurds and Assyrians are not particularly devastated in these attacks because they don't have any political power. But we do see some interesting things to point out with regards to the invasion of Hulagu Khan. I have a question of why are the Yazidi deeply persecuted by both the Taliban and ISIS? First of all, the Yazidi are not persecuted by the Taliban. The Taliban have never come in contact with the Yazidi. Now, if they did, they would certainly persecute them. But it's just from a geographic perspective, it's not possible. Islamic State persecuted them because of the Melik Taus story. As I pointed out, Melik Taus is often made equivalent to Iblis or the devil in Islamic theology, because the story of Melik Taus refusing to bow down to people is similar to the story of Iblis refusing to bow down to people. And so the Yazidi are considered to be devil worshippers. Additionally, their beliefs in things like reincarnation, their strong belief in the Batiniya, and all of these other things put them outside of the limited Sunni perspective that Islamic State has, and therefore their religion was seen as unacceptable. Even less stringent groups have had difficulty accepting Yazidism as a legitimate religion because of these other influences that exist outside of the purview of Islam. And I've actually struggled with whether Yazidism should be considered a post-Islamic religion, because it certainly has Islamic elements, such as the Mudahhariyat, but it also has a number of Zoroastrian elements, and parts of Yazidism have existed in one form or another for over 3,000 years. So it's not entirely clear what their religion is in terms of its origins, but it has all these different elements. And that kind of syncretism is something that Islamic State absolutely cannot stand. We were mentioning, though, the Mongol conquest of Iraq under Hulagu Khan. And Hulagu Khan had both a Nestorian wife and a Nestorian mother, Soghar Khani Beki. Right? We remember the Assyrians under the Nestorian church began to proselytize throughout Central Asia. And so Nestorians were actually key in establishing the Mongol dynasty. So when Hulagu Khan came to Baghdad, his spies who went into the city were Nestorians, and they met with the Assyrian Christians in the city of Baghdad. Accordingly, Once the city was besieged and destroyed, the entire population was slaughtered except for the Assyrian Christians, who were allowed to live. Now, following Hulagu Khan was the establishment of the Ilkhanate, and we talked about that mostly during episode 15. And we had a struggle in the days of the Ilkhanate, in the early days of it. After Hulagu died, he was succeeded by Abaga, and after Abaga, you had a direct conflict between Ahmed Tegurer, who represented the Muslim-leaning side, the Persian-leaning side of the rulership of the Ilkhanate, and you had Arghun representing the Buddhist-leaning side, the Mongol-leaning side of the Ilkhanate. And so the two of them basically had a civil war in 1282 to 1284, with Arghun eventually prevailing. Now, Arghun, because he was a Buddhist, supported the non-Muslim elements of the empire. We talked in episode 15 about Sa'd ad-Dawla, who was his Jewish Grand Vizier from 1289 to 1291 when he died. Well, when both of them died. Arghun from disease and Sa'd ad-Dawla from being attacked. But we also notice that a number of Assyrians are promoted during the reign of Ilkhan Arghun as well, to high offices within the Ilkhanate. Conversely, when Arghun is succeeded by Gaikhatu, who you can see in the upper left-hand side, we see many of those Nestorians either forcibly expelled from those positions or beginning to thin out. When we finally get to Baidu, who you can see in the upper part right above Arghun's head, and Ghazan, who we're going to talk about in a bit, the pendulum had swung the other way, and Islam became the dominant religion and organization of the Ilkhanate. Persians became the dominant bureaucratic class, and accordingly, Assyrians were subject to persecution and recrimination. During the reign of Ilkhan Arghun, you began to have a promotion of Nestorians as a way to create a relationship between the East and the West. In particular, Rabban Bar Soma, who was Ongud, which is a type of Mongol in terms of his ethnicity, was a Nestorian by religion. So he spoke that Syriac language as well as his native Mongolian language. And he was sent by Arghun to go to the West and try and promote the creation of another crusade that would create a pincer movement with the Ilkhanate to attack the Mamluks, who were the enemies of both of those empires. But Rabban Bar Soma's trip to the West gives us a number of sources, Western sources, on the Syriac Christians, and in many cases shows us the surprise of how Christians in Europe saw Christians of the East. Unfortunately for Arghun, no concrete proposals were made by the Europeans to support another crusade. Some because they had already just come back from a crusade, some because they were struggling with their own wars, and others because they didn't see the benefit in it. But regardless, Rabban Bar Soma made Nestorian Christianity part and parcel of world history. That said, as I pointed out, when Ghazan took control in 1295, he did so by converting to Islam, and that led to a large number of troops defecting from Baidu's side to Ghazan's side, and he was able to take power. This led to, as I said, a number of persecutions and recriminations against the Buddhists and the Christians within the regime. Now, In particular, we know a lot about the Assyrians at this period in Arbela, the modern city of Erbil, because when Rabban Barsoma came from Mongolia to Iraq, he didn't come alone. He came with his friend Marcos, who was christened as the new chief bishop of the Church of the East, Mar Yahbalaha III. And Mar Yahbalaha retained his position, resisting a number of sieges to the city of Arbela from Ghazan, trying to forcibly convert that city to Islam and massacre the Assyrians within. We also have Yahbalaha sending numerous messages to Western Europe, hoping for some assistance for the Christians in the East, and no reply. We also have Uljaitu, who was born a Buddhist, converted to Christianity, and then converted later to Sunni and then Shiite Islam in successive years. Uljaitu, when he took power, had already converted to Shiite Islam and persecuted Assyrians again. During this, so if we move the clock about 100 years forward, we have this period where we're beginning to see Timur striking at Baghdad. And those strikes result in a number of deaths and calamities. But in particular, we have the invasion in 1401. And when Timur invades Baghdad in 1401, he kills the entire population of the city. Assyrians are not spared this time like they had been before. Timur also led a campaign against the city of Tikrit, which is north of Baghdad, and had an Assyrian majority. The Assyrians gathered in the Green Church. You can see that church above. And while gathering in the Green Church, Timur still went into the church and slaughtered them within the church. Some Assyrians fled, and they fled north into the hills of Hakkari in what's today Turkey, close to the border with Iraq. And even that wasn't enough to deter Timur. Timur pursued them into the mountains and tried to smoke them out of the caves. Some he was able to do, and those he killed, and others were able to find caves that were deep enough and vast enough that the smoke didn't actually force them out, and so those survived. Now you might be asking what the killing wives is up there for. When Timur conquered the city of Baghdad, he ordered all of his soldiers to kill a quota of people, but the number of people that existed within the city was insufficient to meet those quotas. So many soldiers ended up killing their own wives and killing other soldiers in order to fill their quotas. And so you can see by the time that Timur died, the Jazeera was well within his territory of influence. We then have a number of different Turkic periods that control that area, leading to the Ottoman Empire. And I think we've already passed the witching hour, so I think this is a great place to stop, and we can pick up with the Ottoman Empire next week, and that'll lead perfectly into our discussion of Young Turk revolutions. So, questions, comments, concerns?
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that. Great presentation. What I wanted to ask is, so what incited the war between Sassanians and Byzantium if they were not really in each other's crossroads, except for some of them maybe Syrian territories, but was there a religious war? Because Sassanids wasn't really following Christianity.
Okay. There are actually three major wars between the Byzantines and the Sassanids. But the one that we were talking about was the Third Byzantine-Sassanian War. So I'll talk about that. After the Second Byzantine-Sassanian War, Khosrow II, king of Sassanian Persia, had created a peace treaty with the Byzantine king. The Byzantine emperor, Maurice. And that treaty was signed in 602. And they celebrated their newfound alliance, and they were actually very happy with each other. In 610, a Byzantine military general named Phocas assassinated Maurice because Maurice hadn't paid his unit sufficiently and executed Maurice. That got Khosrow to declare war on Phocas because of the love and friendship that he had for Maurice. So now Phocas died in the early part of the war, but in the early part of the war, the Sassanids were winning. So they continued the war because they thought that maybe they could restore the entire territory of the Achaemenids. And remember, the Sassanids considered themselves the successors, the legal and spiritual successors of the Achaemenids. So the ability to restore the Achaemenid Empire was very appealing to them. At that time, Heraclius, who removed Phocas from power, tried to sue for peace with the Sassanians. When that didn't work, he launched an invasion of Sassanid Persia by way of Armenia. And that was what that war was. So that invasion happened in 624, and the war was eventually resolved in 628 with a status quo antebellum. But because of all of the internal politics that had gone on in the Byzantine Empire and the destruction that Heraclius wrought on Khosrow II's army during the war, effectively it made both empires very weak. But the struggle wasn't a religious one. It was literally Khosrow II believed that Maurice shouldn't have been executed. And if Phocas had never come to power, if Phocas had never killed Maurice, there may well have been peace between the Byzantine and Sassanian empires for quite a while. There's a question that on the map there's a place called Sassoon, and whether I have a connection to it. This has been very commonly asked because Sassoon is an Armenian principality. I'm not connected with that Sassoon. My Sassoon is an English version of Sasson, right? The Hebrew word meaning joy and festivity. So it has no connection with the region of Sassoon, which is an Armenian region. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
You touched on Parthians versus Sassanid.
Sure.
Now, to me, since Seleucus, which was the Diadochi, kind of like went away, and Ptolemy and all those Greek Macedonian kingdoms, Parthians were more a Persian combination with maybe Greek, sprinkle a little bit of Greek culture. But why
Sure.
didn't they just reintegrate into Sassanids instead of them taking over Parthians? I mean, how much of an integration was with Greek society, and how much was integration with the Persians?
Okay, so there's sort of two things to sort of suss out here. The Parthians were a Persianate people in the same way that the Scythians are a Persianate people. They speak a language that's close to Persian, but they're not Persians. And so to the Sassanids, that was a hugely important distinction. The Sassanids saw themselves as Persian, and they saw the people who came from outside of the region of Fars, like the Parthians did, as being less Persian and not having the right to rule the Achaemenid Empire. And so that's the antagonism that exists there. But so the Sassanids was an internal revolt that eventually swallowed up the empire that had previously owned them. That said, while the Parthians lost their ability to rule, many of the Parthian nobility in various regions were willing to make peace with Ardashir the first king of the Sassanians. And because those nobles were willing to make peace with Ardashir I and continue their reign, throughout the history of the Sassanid Empire, there have been Parthian nobility who exercised a disproportionate amount of control over the future of the Sassanian Empire. They murdered different Sassanian kings, chose their own Sassanian kings to take power, and the creation of the Deccan by Ardashir and Shapur I was an attempt by those rulers to create a Persian nobility that could counter the Parthians, who still retained all this power on a local level. So the Parthians still maintained power, but for the Sassanids, they didn't want them to rule in name because of the cultural difference and the fact that they weren't Persian. They didn't feel that they had the legal right, that the Parthians had the legal right to rule what should be a Persian empire.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, I don't want to hold you up, but I guess the last question that really bothers me. So in today's Persia, we have a huge population of both Azeris and Armenians living within Persia. Does it stem back from the Sassanid Empire and integration and kind of non-religious tolerance, so to speak? How did it come to be?
Okay, I would say this. The Sassanids were not known for being religiously tolerant. That's why we had numerous persecutions of Christians that we talked about during the reigns of Yazdegerd II, during the reign of Shapur II, during the reign of Shapur I, and I'm going backwards chronologically. But we only have some small periods where that breaks. So like Yazdegerd I is a rare example of the opposite, where the Persian Empire was accepting writ large of other religions. There's a reason why the Armenians fought the battles of Avareya and Navarsak. There's a reason, and so the toleration that exists in Iran today is not a result of the Sassanians. It's part of the revival of a Achaemenid culture that exists in fits and starts throughout Iranian history. The Parthians were actually much more tolerant, and following the Sassanians, the Muslims were much more tolerant. So that's that. In terms of the Armenians who are living within the borders of Iran today, most of the Armenians who are living in Iran are the result of the deportations by Shah Abbas that we talked about in lecture 21. And those deportations resulted in Armenians from the city of Julfa, which is in today Nakhchivan region in Azerbaijan, into Isfahan. And so that's where the Armenian population within Iran really comes from, as well as just Armenians that moved because of the Silk Road trade. The cultural toleration between Azerbaijanis and Armenians within Iran is really a result of them living in different areas of the country and by Iranian leadership really not meddling on a local level on the conflicts between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. And so both have the respect of the empire. All right. So I think I'm going to.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to close it out. I'll see everybody next week.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. Thank you, Richard.
All right. Bye. I have a comment actually. I had no idea that there were so many post-Islamic religions. Yeah, and I think that Islam, as to the extent that we can say that Islam has a propaganda arm, like all religious communities do, Islam really likes to downplay their Mormons and pretend like they don't exist, but they do, right? Just as Mormonism is a post-Christian religion, we have numerous post-Islamic religions. And it's only natural. People's beliefs will change and develop, and you end up with a lot of different faiths. And the Kurds are disproportionately representative of those faiths because, as a community that hides in the mountains, you're going to have a lot more diversity there than you're going to have in the lowland regions, which can easily be conquered and expunged. But all right, so see everybody next week, and